Emma, can you get the trunk for me? The dim winter sun was setting over the parking lot, nearly devoid of shoppers at this late hour, aside from a van in one distant corner that had just started backing out of its spot. I set my bag down in the passenger seat and rounded the side of my mom's penicillium green Camry. Met with her impatient and lightly sweating face, I popped the trunk, allowing her to practically collapse into it with the weight of the groceries. Something burst in one of the bags, prompting her to curse under her breath. I just don't get why you won't stick a quarter in those trolleys over there. You get it back afterwards. Mom, still arranging the bags into a position that would stop them from toppling over on the drive home, looked at me scornfully. The Walmart downtown doesn't make you pay, and none of the stores around here do, so why should I? You know we only come here to Aldi's because it's cheaper. I just said you get the quarter back afterwards. It's to make sure people put the shopping carts back. I sighed, knowing there was no swaying her. Instead of shooting back with some flimsy reasoning, she patted her pockets and swore. Oh, god damn it, I've gone and left my wallet at the till again, haven't I? Before I could get a word out, she was gone like a rocket, racing against the store's closing time. Night's chill descended, raising goosebumps, so I slammed the trunk and hopped back into the passenger seat out of the cold. I sat there, praying that my mom had the haste to get back soon with the keys so she could start up the heating. There was something else, though. My heart made itself known with a rising, incessant pulse. It felt like something was wrong. Not this again. I groaned, shutting my eyes and following a basic breathing routine to calm my nerves. The anxiety was bad enough, but the anger I felt at the nonsense panic had always been worse for me. Just stop it. Lasagna's waiting for us at home. It's gonna be so... I opened my eyes. Had I heard something? No, not heard. Felt? I don't know. I leaned forward to scan the parking lot. Nothing. Then I jumped back in my seat. There it was again. It was subtle, so much so that I was surprised I'd even noticed it. A light but bone-deep vibration was emanating from somewhere. Like someone nearby was subtly trying to pull down a gigantic zipper, one tooth at a time. The comparison should have sounded silly and ridiculous, but my heart continued to pound faster and faster, till I was sure, beyond a doubt, that something bad was going to happen. Something was really wrong. Took me longer than I'd have liked to get out, with the seatbelt clamping as I struggled to unbuckle. There was no smell in the air. Did I smell something before? I couldn't remember. No more cars in the lot. Only the Camry. No more noise. Again, that slight vibration in the air. Too low a frequency to determine its source, but enough to just sense that it was there. I tilted my head, staring up at the lumpy clouds that cast shadows on each other. Those clouds. I've always loved how they look around sundown. It helped ease my heart a little. Until one of the shadows moved. I'm not stupid. I thought it was just a cloud shadow matching its slow drift across the sky. I squinted. Shadow wasn't being cast on a cloud. It was above, or maybe behind them. Which made me realize whatever I was seeing couldn't be a shadow. What happened next is pretty hard to articulate. I've never seen anything else like it before or since. The dark mass above the clouds began to sort of extend, beaming down at an angle. Like sun rays, but moving at a steady pace, or how water or ink moves up paper by way of capillary action. A black beam. But it was more than that. I was so absorbed in the spectacle, I hadn't fully dawned on me that this thing was getting closer. Closer to me. And as it closed in, there was no mistaking it. While it continued to stretch all the way back above the clouds, the outline of it, the cross-section, was almost human-shaped. Arms, head, body, and legs. But the limbs ended in stunted nubs like a stick figure. By the time it stopped a good 3 or 4 stories above, I still hadn't moved. I could do nothing but watch in disbelief as lights and layers of color began to flash inside this humanish-looking figure, seeming to have parallax, as if whatever lay beyond was a space of its own. Amazingly, something managed to distract me for a moment. A flash of light in my peripheral. Phone flashlight. Emma? Emma, are you having a stroke or something? I blinked. No, Mom was back, apparently still without her wallet. Now scanning the asphalt for any sign of it. Why didn't I hear her coming back? Stop standing there like an idiot and help me find it. Come on, it's getting late. I did, in fact, keep standing there, glancing between her and this flashing shadow prism thing above us. Did a double take. Those glaringly bright, almost offensively colored layers were speeding up towards the end of the beam, towards me, piling up on themselves to assemble a sort of figure, stepping soundlessly out into thin air. Mom kept calling for me. I heard her, but I couldn't process her words. Everything else was secondary to the figure above us. It had fully formed, cloaked in a coarse-looking gown, with skin so pale and shadeless it was as if it radiated a faint glow. The sound of rapid footsteps brought me back to myself. I looked down just in time to see my mom, face painted in a teetering mixture of worry and annoyance. She went to speak, but I held up a hand and pointed to that figure. She squinted at me and looked to where I was pointing and just froze. The whole time I'd secretly been hoping I was just hallucinating or saw some kind of light reflection or something like that. But she saw it too. She saw something at least, and that was enough to confirm what I had been dreading. "Who is that?" she asked. Her voice sounded so small and dry. If I could have spoken, I'd have instead asked, "What is that?" Instead, I watched on in terror as this figure began a slow descent, straight down. The closer it drew, the more of it I could make out. There were these iridescent lines floating across the surface of its skin, moving like sun patterns on the bottom of a swimming pool. Like the silhouette it had emerged from. It had no hands or feet, just rounded nubs as limbs. Although, those on its arms had the same slight depression in the center. The car, Mom, the car, get in the car. No response. I reached out, grabbing her by the arm and shaking her, but she was absolutely rigid. One of us had to move, and I imagined we were both hoping the other would do so. A second figure emerged from the prism, identical to the first, except it was wearing a plain t-shirt and shorts. At the same time, the first one finally touched down on the asphalt and stood tilting its head up. It looked like it was waiting for the other one to arrive. If I had any lingering doubt that these things weren't human, it was squashed when I saw their faces, or lack of them. I didn't see ears. I didn't see where a face should have been, only a circular metal grate. It looked like it might have been gold or maybe brass. The four of us stood there, still and silent. They stared at us, and we stared right back, completely lost in the foreign sight of the beings. A breath, then they turned to each other. I don't know if I expected them to talk or something, but they didn't. At least not in any language I know. Faint at first, getting brighter with every pulse. Constellations began to flash behind the metal face grates of each of them. I heard nothing aside from a few damped vibrations, yet somehow I felt like I knew that there was a conversation going on. Very slowly I took a step back and reached an arm behind me to feel for the car. All the while my eyes stayed locked on these beings. Kept reaching further and further, but my fingers brushed nothing but air. One of them abruptly turned and looked at me. Or at my mom, I couldn't tell. My chest tightened. This wasn't happening. Raised one stunted arm to point at my mom. Realizing another cascade of flashing lights behind its grill face, the other crossed its arms and looked over too, like it was waiting for something. I had to risk it. I pivoted, throwing a glance over my shoulder. The car was 20, maybe 25 feet away. I didn't remember wandering that far from it. I noticed something else then. The trees, the grass, all of the greenery surrounding the parking lot was gone. Gave me the impression of a planet that had never evolved life, or where all life was extinct. There was only bare, dark soil enclosing the lot. Seconds before I went for the car, Mom let out a scream, one that I could still hear from time to time, in dreams and background noise. Spun around to see the first being, the one wearing a gown gliding across the ground with an outstretched arm. Mom didn't have time to move, as it came to a dead stop before her, arm still raised. And I saw something emerging from that small depression at the end of its stump. What I now understood was a hole. Whatever came out was darker than the night sky, blacker than black, and I couldn't place its shape, but it looked like it was made out of a mass of some kind of ever-shifting black crystals. She screamed again, but it was more of a gasp this time, one that lasted barely a second before a bubble broke free from the shifting appendage and fixed itself over her mouth, silencing her. Another 4 floated down to her wrists and ankles, binding her in place and stopping her from moving as one more broke off from the being. Looked a little like an arrowhead or some other sharp, triangular tool, a razor cutting edge through the air and hovering just over her stomach. I understood the danger then. Not for me, but her. Abandoning caution, I leapt forward, yelling, but I rolled my ankle and went crashing down onto the cold, hard asphalt. I was dazed, but I tried to lift myself and managed to look up at the beings with blood pouring from my nose and a cut on my cheek. One in front of my mom barely seemed to notice me, giving me a quick look, then getting back to the matter at hand, whatever that might have been. She squirmed against her restraints, issuing muffled groans through her nose. I forced my limbs to work, but I was held fast. Mounds of that shifting black crystal had smothered my hands, binding them to the ground. I looked at my mom, helpless and terrified. She met my eyes and blinked away a tear and squeezed her eyelids shut. At the back, that being wearing a t-shirt made some kind of gesture like it was impatient, and that robed being nodded, turning back to my mom and directing that arrow-shaped object. At the same time, her blouse began to lift up and off of her, pulled by some kind of invisible force, exposing her stomach. Being hesitated for a second, and I felt like I had a spark of hope that it might show more mercy. However, I couldn't have been more wrong. The dark arrowhead pressed into her skin, slicing through layers like butter and dragging a line downwards, leaving a clean incision. Wasting no time, the being reached inside and fiddled around for a moment, then pulled out the severed end of my mom's intestine. Blood splattered the ground, trailing away from her as the being floated backwards, keeping hold of that organ until it was stretched to its length. Tasted bile and vomit. "Stop, you fucks, you fucking monsters!" A gush of vomit interrupted me, flooding out onto the ground and mixing in with the intestinal fluids to create some disgusting speckled pattern, which prompted another wave of vomit from me and tears to cloud my vision. I wiped my sleeve over my eyes so I could see. That being in a t-shirt had a long, pole-shaped protrusion stretching out from the end of its arm, extending to match the length of my mother's intestines. It studied something for a second before shrugging and seemingly nodding at that roped being. In the blink of an eye, the intestines retracted back like a frightened snake and piled back inside my mom's body. I just stared, unable to comprehend what was happening. The sides of the incision pulled into each other and appeared to heal completely in a matter of seconds. As soon as I'd processed this, I felt my restraint slacken, then disappear entirely. I shot onto my feet, nearly tripping over, and I grasped onto my mom's arm. I pulled under the assumption that she'd been released, but she wasn't. They weren't letting her go. Freezing up, I cranked my head to look at one of the beings. More flashing lights. The one in a t-shirt was handing something over to the other, but I couldn't see anything passing between them. Maybe it was something invisible, or something my mind just wasn't built to perceive. Continued to tug mechanically, trying to free her. Her skin was cold and slick, and she was shivering. It did no good, though. That black crystal held fast. Nearly collapsed in relief and shock when the robed figure began to ascend back up to that prism it had come from. But the other grabbed onto its gown, communicating something. The robed being dropped back down, but threw its arms out in what I'd guessed was frustration. The one in the t-shirt gestured towards us again, still conversing with the other, waving his arms around. Still, that robed figure seemed to acquiesce and slid across the ground towards us again. Lights continued to flash behind its grill face, all varying shades of orange and red, like it was angry. Couldn't let it happen again, and I lunged at it, planning to do something I didn't even really know in the moment. Just wanted to protect my mom. Right as I made contact with the being, I felt a shift in the air. The fluid in my ears swirled and made me dizzy. My eyes stopped rolling to the side. I realized I was being held still by two pale, stunted arms, with odd patches of hot and cold traveling around on its skin. Somehow I'd wound up in the arms of the being wearing a t-shirt, and those arms held me tight, tighter than any living being should be able to. "Get off of me!" I screamed, flailing and lashing out. In a desperate bet for escape, I tried to bite down on one of its arms. Felt like I'd been curb-stomped, like I'd bitten down with the full force of concrete or something. I gave up after that. It just hurt too much to think. Instead, I took in my surroundings. Where was I? A roped being was standing in the way of her, but it was doing something. I couldn't see what, but by the way my mom was squealing behind her gag, it made the first procedure sound like a pillow fight. I just cried. There was no other avenue for relief except tears. And everything went quiet. Mom trailed off into a whine and then nothing. No wind and no trees or leaves rustling, because they'd all vanished. Just me, Mom, and these things. The one holding me loosened my grip and I gasped, gulping down stagnant air. Floated over to where Mom was, and the robed being stepped aside, finally letting me see what was happening. I didn't really want to know. I didn't, but my muscles were locked in place. In one hand, the robed being held one end of an artery it had pulled out of my mom's chest. Without warning, the two entities shot up into the air, coming to a halt somewhere above. As they moved, more blood vessels phased through the skin of my mom's body, contorting and straightening to fuse at their ends, forming some unholy, pulsing rope. Speed faster than I could process, the beings flew away, vanishing into the night while clutching the single fused vessel of veins, arteries, and capillary. There was blood, but only a little bit. All seemed to be contained in that one long tube, and they continued to pull along through the atmosphere. From the opposite direction they'd passed once, saw them pass over one more time and disappear into the distance before the meaty vessel pulled taut. At the time, I hadn't really pieced it together. I think they'd looped around the entire planet. Not once, but twice. Sounds ridiculous to say, I know. And then some, in what couldn't have been more than 10 seconds. I blinked and they were back, standing in the parking lot and flashing their lights at each other once more. Didn't even have the energy to whisper and protest. T-shirt one looked reluctant in some way and handed over more of something I couldn't see to the robed entity. As they did this, the red string they'd made from Mom's blood vessels pulled back by itself at impossible speeds, retracting out of over 2 loops of planet Earth and back into her, breaking apart, phasing back inside, and reassembling into their proper structure. Or that's what I'd guessed based on the first procedure. Glassy-eyed and so pale, the crystalline restraints dissolved and my mom slumped limp to the ground. Stood motionless for a second before realizing my own restraints were gone as well, and I bolted over to her. I was whispering something, assurances, maybe apologies. I don't really remember. 2 beings watched us, and then they ascended, back up into that dark prism and out of sight. It began to pull back up into the sky, and when I blinked, all the trees and the grass were back. It all felt normal, or almost normal. The only change was that the sky was a little darker, and my mom felt a little colder. Then a lot colder. I placed 2 fingers on her neck, and there was no pulse. When the paramedics arrived, they rushed over to us. Their movements were frantic but controlled. Just 30 seconds later, that urgent energy was gone, replaced by a dull rhythm that told me all I needed to know. She was pronounced dead on the scene. The coroner later concluded that my mom had simply died. No cause could be found, but brain damage signified a level of hypoxia. I guess that's what happens when your blood is outside of you, even if just for a minute. Strangely, I found my anxiety to diminish after that night. Still flares up now and then, but most of the time there's just this hollow feeling in its place. I don't go to Aldi's anymore. Seems silly to mull over something like that. But I can't even be near those big parking lots now. I just get my groceries delivered. Maybe it sounds like I'm managing. I am. Inside, though, there's a crack that can't be fixed, can't be filled. It's worn down over time, gotten less jagged and easier to deal with. Things don't really shock me anymore, or at least that shock is dulled. There will be no justice for her. Even if I sought it, I doubt we could ever even access whatever plane of existence those beings hail from. Whatever power we think we have, all those things see when they come look at us is a world of monkeys banging stones together. I'm sure of it. In fact, I'm willing to bet on it, as much as they bet on my mom.